Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the webinar Artists on the Moon Lessons from an All Artist analog Lunar Surface Mission, produced by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. I am Remo Rapetti, co chair of this working group. Analog sites have proved to be very useful in testing human behavior in conditions similar to those found in space or on the surface of the moon. Since 1997, when NASA started the first analog mission in Arizona, many locations in quite several nations, from the US to Chile, from Norway to Hawaii, from Switzerland to Antarctica, etc., have been regularly used to test equipment, train astronauts, and especially to study how human bodies and minds react when confronting very harsh physical, social, and psychological conditions. Last spring, in the space analog for Moon and Mars located on the campus of Arizona U, our four guests, a writer, a poet, a dancer, and a costume designer, lived for 1 week testing how a crew of astronauts can stand isolation, cohabitation, low gravity, and some more hardships connected with space exploration. Therefore, we thought it could be exciting to hear their feelings from their voices, especially the impact that this experience possibly had on their creativity, both on location and afterward. Christopher Kokinos, an outstanding writer and winner of awards and fellowships from the New American Press, the Whiting Foundation, the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, and the National Science Foundation, etc., will start the webinar, and then we'll introduce his colleagues and fellow adventurers, Elizabeth George, Julie Shorstad Johnson, and Ivy Wahome. After their presentations, my co-chair Lisa Pettibone, renowned artist, and the Spanish anthropologist Cristina Luna Santos will add comments and questions. Also, the attendees can ask questions using the chat button. And now, let's go to the presentation. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Remo, very much. And I just want to thank the Moon Village Association and the Moon Village Association Cultural Considerations Working Group, with whom I've been sort of loosely affiliated now for a little while. We've done a number of different programs, and I just want to extend my gratitude to Lisa and Remo, to Christina Glafke, and everyone associated with the MVA and the Cultural Considerations Working Group, because culture and space, it's important that those things are not separated, that the engineers also pay attention to the poets, as it were. And I also just want to say that the Moon Village Association vision of a just and sustainable approach to policy is certainly one that I know all of my co-presenters share. So thank you very much for having us. I just want to also acknowledge, my dear friends and crewmates, Julie Swarstead Johnson, and Liz George and Ivy Wahome. Love you guys. I am in Logan, Utah, where I took an early retirement from the University of Arizona, and my three crewmates and friends are in Tucson. So let me begin. Yeah, Julie, I guess I'll just jump right in with the slides. Julie is our Master of Technology as an archivist at the Poetry Center at the University of Arizona. She is has been indispensable in keeping us on track with everything from slide presentations to managing our digital archives and so forth. So yeah, next slide. That was the logo. Actually, I'm sorry, Julie. Let's go back. I know Ivy will talk about this, but the logo, which we love, Imagination One, was the name of this analog mission. Artists on the Moon at the Space Analog for Moon and Mars, Biosphere 2, 2024. And I know Ivy will say a little bit more about the logo. What I'll just say is that if you're familiar with mission patches that crews have had and missions have had for many decades now, they can be quite artistic and interesting, but there's also a sort of hard edge to them. And one of the things that I think I love and I think my crewmates loved about Ivy's vision here of the four of us standing on the surface of the moon, looking toward the Earth, was a sense of softness, and I mean that in a good way, like the sort of softness of our flesh in the hardscape of the lunar environment. So we really love this logo, and so thank you, Ivy, for developing that for us. Next slide. So from idea to next steps, the four of us. Go ahead, Julie. And what I want to do, and there I am standing. I don't remember, Julie, when was this taken, before or after the mission? Do you recall?
This was before. This was the day we went in.
The day we went in. Okay, so I'm smiling, not just completely naive about what a harrowing experience we're going to have. No, it actually went very smoothly. So let me just talk you through the sort of overview here. The genesis of this idea came at AAC, which stands for the Analog Astronaut Conference, which happens every early May. And it's been happening at Biosphere 2 now for, I think, 3 or 4 years. So in 2022, I attended the Analog Astronaut Conference. And I don't recall why Julie was not able to attend with me, but we had co-edited. Julie was the lead editor on a book called Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight, which I was delighted to work with her to help edit. And so it's a book of poetry spanning from the Sputnik era all the way to sort of science fictional imaginations of the future of humans in space. This was published by the University of Arizona Press. And so Julie and I separately and together have done a lot of presentations from this anthology. So I gave a talk at the Analog Astronaut Conference, a set of readings, poems from that book, and it went very well, and people were very enthusiastic. And one of the people who was interested and enthused was a fellow named Kai Statz, who is the director of research for this analog facility that is associated with Biosphere 2. And in that conversation, it became clear, it's like, we should have an artist mission. We should send artists to the moon, as it were. And so that was the genesis of the idea. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, the planning that happened over actually more like an 18-month process, the training, which happened a couple days prior to the physical training, happened a couple days prior to the mission, which took place March 10th through 15th, and then say a little bit about outcomes and next steps. And I know my dear colleagues will have more to say about that. So there's the book, Beyond Earth's Edge, The Poetry of Spaceflight. The other thing to say about the genesis of this was the original timing was such that I was planning for this analog mission, should it happen, to be the last chapter of the other book you see on the right, which just came out, my book on the moon, Still as Bright, an illuminating history of the moon from antiquity to tomorrow. So the last chapter was going to be the mission. But go ahead, Julie. And we weren't able to actually make the mission happen in 2023 because the facility wasn't entirely complete. And so I was left a little scrambling on my end. It's like, I don't know how I'm going to end my book. And so instead of the mission being the last chapter of Still as Bright is actually a pilgrimage to an observatory in California, where I know Lisa is right now, and observing the moon through a 60-inch telescope. But I did, in fact, write about the mission. I'll say a little bit more about that. And I want to point you to this quote from William Bezuska, who in 2021 said this in a policy paper for the something called the Aerospace Corporation, which is a conglomeration of the leading astronautics aerospace companies. And their white papers tend to be policy, they tend to be technical, but he wrote one on the arts and space. And this is what he says: the world abounds with tangible examples of this spirit in the work that connects art and space. Organizations that seek to identify and foster these connections may find benefits across the spectrum of space activity, while at the same time supporting one of the most fundamental human activities, creating art. So if I'm a little bit of an evangelical about anything, it's about this, which is bringing artists and scientists, creatives and engineers together so that we understand a little bit more about the kind of activity that art can, sort of engage in, artists can engage in on the Earth and in space. And I know, for example, Lisa might be able to say a little bit about some of the work she's done that has involved actual spacecraft. So there are these connections. There are these partnerships that happen, but a lot more yet to be done. And that was part of the spirit of the Imagination One mission of Artists on the Moon. Go ahead. And this is where we imagined going. So we had a 6-day mission planned out. And the plan, of course, for the Artemis missions and the Chinese missions that are also in the works is to go to this region of the moon. This is near the lunar South Pole. And there are regions there that have not seen sunlight in about 4 billion years. And there are regions along the ridges of a lot of those craters that have permanent sunlight because of the orientation of the moon with the sun. And in those craters, there are a couple of resources. I put in air quotes. I'd like to call them gifts. One of them is water ice, and that can be used, of course, to turn into drinking water, into oxygen, and into hydrogen rocket fuel. But the other resource, the other gift, is the beauty of this place in and of itself. And we have, of course, a long, multicultural, multidimensional, eons deep relationship with the moon as we look at it from Earth. So apart then, there's this sense of the sublime, this larger mission of, trying to bring the two cultures together, as C.P. Snow wrote in, I think, the 1950s in his famous essay about the sort of humanities culture and the science culture, which, and again, there's sort of more blending than there used to be, but they're still, in some respects, quite separate, and that's true in the space community. So we go from that sort of larger scale vision of ideas and concepts and beauty and so forth to the logistics, from the sublime to the ridiculous, as it were. So approaching supporters, drafting a mission plan, selecting a crew, planning organization, all of this was on the plate early on. As soon as Kai expressed an interest in this, I approached Julie, because we had worked together on the anthology, and I knew that she would absolutely need to be involved. And so we started talking all this through. What really made the mission happen in a practical sense was getting a support from the dean of the College of Fine Arts at the University of Arizona. So and I have a slide at the end of my show thanking, at the end of the presentation, thanking a number of these supporters. But it really does come down to money, right? Approaching people. Julie did fundraising on her own, going to the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory, among other places. I could self-fund some of this myself. So that was crucial, getting people sort of locked into place. And I would say the College of Fine Arts was absolutely instrumental in making this happen. So we had to draft a mission plan as well, like what were our goals? And those goals were both individual and collective. And again, all of us will talk a little bit about that. But the whole point was, what would it be like for an artist crew to be in a facility that was a science and engineering facility, running it, keeping it clean, keeping it, humming, not damaging anything, making sure nothing breaks. And if something breaks, we fix it. We would, in an isolated setting without internet, without immediate connectivity. And so we had email contact with the mission control folks, Stats and the others with SAM, the space analog from Moon and Mars. So we had to pull all that together and think about what it was we were going to do individually and collectively. I'll say a little bit more about that when we get to some of the outcomes. Then it was crew selection. Julie was on board immediately, and because then the College of Fine Arts sponsored the two other slots that we were so wonderfully lucky to have Liz and Ivy win those competitions. We went through a application process with folks at the College of Fine Arts, and Liz and Ivy were selected to be members of the crew. And then it became a matter of, and I know other folks here, my crewmates may have some funny anecdotes to share about, how we, sort of went through this process. And again, it was sort of start and stop because we were planning on 2023. It was go, 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 go. And then suddenly we were told, I think, just 2 or 3 weeks before the planned mission, which was disappointing and crushing in a couple of instances. And yet it was also very much like how space missions actually work, where you're go, 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 you're ready to go, and then the mission is scrubbed. So we had then a few more months to have Zoom meetings among the 4 of us to talk about a number of different things and kind of get to know each other. So go ahead, Julie. So that brought us to training. Online familiarity was really important. Julie and I knew each other well. And as it turned out, Liz and Ivy knew each other because they both work in the performing arts. And so there were these connections already kind of baked into the crew. And I think, I don't know if it's just a question of luck, but we all just got along and got along so well. And so even though I was physically distant, and the other 3 dear crewmates were there in Tucson, I think that sort of online meetings, and we were meeting about once a month, and we were doing everything from first aid, conflict resolution, because when you're locked in a tight environment, you need to know how to mediate conflicts. Knowing about the moon, I brought my sense of research, having written the book, to my crewmates, and then they of course educated the rest of us about their disciplines. We were talking about the projects that we would do, and we were becoming a crew. We were becoming friends. And then we spent that weekend, and you can see the to-do list there, just to give you a sense of behind the scenes with Stats, and I'll mention a number of the people that working with him at SAM, a tremendous amount of work. And the weekend, the 2 days of training was intense. We went through the SAM systems. This is a pressurized habitat. NASA doesn't even have a pressurized habitat. So we were going to be monitoring the air pressure, air quality, water usage, and all of these things. And so we were oriented, and then we also put on these pressure suits. So these are actual operable pressure suits that we got familiar with because at the near the end of the week there, we each had a chance to put those suits on, and as you'll see, get hooked up to a rig that offset our weight, so it felt as though we were at 1/6 lunar G. There we are. Before or after some intense training session, maintaining our cordiality and happiness and goodwill, and lots of laughter and jokes and happiness in the midst of all the pressure. I think we've got another couple crew pictures here. Yeah, here we are. No, go back, Julie. I just want to point out something here. So the smiles, my slightly manic face. I really can't emphasize enough how important it was that we had this goodwill and sense of humor. And I want you to notice the background there too. Those are the Catalina Mountains. And go ahead and go to the mission slide. When we were in SAM, that was originally the test module for Biosphere 2. So Biosphere 2 was, as most of you probably know, I'll just quickly say, in the 1990s, the site of a 2-year long duration mission with 8 people put into this multi habitat facility. but before they did that, there was a test module, and you'll see some pictures here in a second. The test module was originally used to test the Biosphere 2 systems because it was going to be a closed system. This is the lung, and we projected, Julie brought the projection equipment, and these are some photographs from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. This is the Marias Hills region being projected on the side of what is called the lung. And the lung is basically just this circular chamber with a dome that rises and falls, and that controls the pressure on the upstairs portion of the habitat. And here we are doing various things. As it turns out, and anyone who camps or backpacks or has been in another extreme environment, a lot of what you do is housekeeping. And so that's a lot of what we were doing. Vacuuming, cooking meals using dehydrated foods. Julie and I drank the recycled water that was, from the condensate, our breath being filtered through the condensate of the mini split climate system, and then collected and filtered through a carbon filter. And Liz and Ivy, I don't think either of you drank the water. Is that correct? Yeah, weren't going to do it. Okay, so Julie and I drank our own breath, and you can see Ivy and Julie on the other on the right side of the slide, measuring the distance from the floor of the lung to the bottom of that dome, or that sort of pan that rises and falls. And so we had to keep track of that. The next slide. One of our notebooks here on the left, lots of note taking in terms of, again, pressure, carbon dioxide. Every evening and morning, I would talk with Julie and Liz, who looks a little, I don't know, like maybe I didn't, she's a little dubious in this photograph. I'm not sure why. Probably like, why am I taking your picture? And we kept notes, and I would write mission control reports, letting them know what was going on, any difficulties we were having with systems, which really was quite minimal. And plant experiments you can see in the background in that sort of purplish light, the rack, the hydroponic rack. And Ivy spent a lot of time in that part of the module working on sewing a tapestry. And I know she'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But because she was there, she sort of took ownership over tracking nutrient levels and so forth with the plants. So we each sort of had different tasks that we would do throughout the day to keep the mission humming, to keep the facility clean, and so forth. And that's a pressure gauge in the middle slide there. So yeah, go ahead, Julie. Sorry. I think this photograph was maybe on the first day, but this is again in the lung. I'm poking out of a tunnel that was just basically a crawl through from the lung, which is sort of subsurface, into the rest of the habitat. One of the other experiments that we ran, this was a project of mine, was to grow plants in ground up lunar meteorite dust. So I had a lot of support from the University of Florida, Rob Furl and Annalisa Paul from the University of Florida. So I took lunar simulant, sort of fake lunar soil, which is basically ground up volcanic dust. And then I also had a lunar meteorite, a tiny little shred of lunar meteorite. You could buy these commercially, and had the dealer grind them up. And with their instructions, I grew watercress seeds in both of those soils, but I was most excited. This is ground up lunar meteorite that you're seeing here, has had some terrestrial, stuff mixed into it because the meteorite had landed on the Earth. But I was just so thrilled to have these little tiny green leaves appear in lunar meteorite soil. The University of Florida had actually done that experiment under controlled conditions with actual lunar soil from the Apollo 17 mission. Go ahead. So a little science. This is in the engineering bay. This is a little workstation. I have some photographs here that I was taking with an analog film camera, instant film camera from the Lomography company. And then this is the monitor, the CIMOC monitor that shows all the different sort of levels of CO2 and air pressure and so forth in the different parts of the habitat that we would keep track of. This is one of the photographs. This actually was the first one I took, I believe. This is a MiG-29 helmet. I think Liz used this. I think Liz and Ivy, did you use this helmet on your extravehicular excursions? And so this is a multiple exposure. It looks a little creepy. It's I got this is from the mushroom colony that we also were feeding with food scraps. And so the mushrooms are growing out of the helmet. I don't know what the symbolic significance of that is, if any, but I love surrealist juxtaposition. And one of the things I wanted to do, I was writing, I wrote an article, I wrote a couple of articles about the mission, but I also wanted to do this photography, again, showing the less hard-edged aspects of spaceflight using film, instant film. I'm almost done too, by the way, so go ahead. Another photograph, this is the lung. This is actually jump over to the next one, Julie, the next one. So on my extravehicular activity, I took the camera. Ivy, and you don't see it here, but she had sewn a pouch for us. So we put on these pressure suits, and we were doffing and donning them on our own. And then we would go out into this area and get hooked up on this rig, and you'll see, sort of simulated gravity. But my task, what I wanted to focus on, apart from just the experience of being in a pressure suit, which we can talk more about, it was fascinating. It was hard, was to take pictures with my little camera. I had only two photographs out of the entire film. Roll actually came out, and this one came out. So this was my selfie on the moon. So we each made progress on our projects, and we'll talk about that. I just wanted to point out we were the first crew at SAM to use the gravity offset rig. We were the first crew to don and doff the pressure suits on our own instead of having the guys and women in their t-shirts outside the habitat helping us. We did that ourselves. We used the least amount of water at present, so we've set that record. We were extremely conservative in our water usage for cleaning. And we were the first crew to drink the recycled water. We're going to continue to develop and share our work. We're going to continue to encourage the University of Arizona to have these crews at the Space Analog for Moon and Mars. It's a really wonderful facility to have as a resource for the University of Arizona and for others. And I would encourage you to take a look at the SAM website. So the project, I wrote about the mission for Esquire magazine, and I'll put some links in here as the presentation continues. I did an interview with the Lomography magazine, and I wrote a piece for the Telegraph. And then we also, the crew was featured on an episode with the Moon Gallery, and also an EU-based outfit, and this Arizona Illustrated, Arizona Public Media episode that just aired a couple nights ago, if you're interested in seeing those. So I just want to thank our supporters, Andy Schultz, Ellen McMahon at the Fine Arts College, the Poetry Center, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory, and everyone involved in SAM, Kai Statz, the Director of Research, and his wonderful crew, Luna Powell, Trent Tresh, Bindu Oman, and Matthias Beach, and of course to my crew. And I'll end with this quote in the next slide. Each day we dispersed like mindful molecules in a sealed vat. So that was just a little bit of a quick overview of the mission. I know there's a lot more to say. Thank you, and I'll turn this over to Julie.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, we're really thankful to be here with you and just to explain, talk to you about what we did. So I'm Julie Swarstad Johnson, and I served as the more or less the first officer, so kind of supporting Chris and all of the planning and some of the things that we needed to just take care of to make sure this all worked. But I'm also a poet, and that was my main task on this mission. And so I'm a poet who thinks a lot about place. I think a lot about plants, animals, ecology. I think about landscapes. I think about things that are outside. I love to be outside. And so for me, this was a really interesting task to be part of this crew because I was going to be completely separated from the outside world. Instead of being able to go on a walk, instead of being able to sort of use my senses outside, I was going to need to think about this interior space and kind of imagine the moon that would be outside, since we were in Arizona. We were not actually on the moon. And so there was this active imagination that went into the whole thing. So in addition then to being a poet, I'm also a printmaker. I do letterpress printing, which is the old school type of printing where you have movable type or movable images. But so with type, it's these individual pieces. You have individual, you can have wood or lead letters, and then you're setting each individual part of the word. So I really love thinking about the physicality of language. I love thinking about sounds, and I love thinking about, with printmaking, just the fact that you're working with individual letters to create meaning, to present this image that people can sit with away from you as the creator. They can interpret it and experience it on their own. So when I went going into this mission and thinking about the work that I as a poet wanted to do, I came to it thinking about, thinking about moving from that outside reality to what's it going to be like to be inside. I was also thinking about poetry, again, connecting it with printing, that I think of poetry as being this really vital, distilled version of language. Poems can be very verbose or can go on at length, but they also, I think, are something where you distill an experience or a thought in a way that you're using the most important words, the most important words in the most important order, or the best order, and you're trying to aim for surprise, to juxtapose things, to give people a different entry point, rather than just reading about an experience, which in itself can be very powerful, but reading about it in a way that challenges them or asks them to do something a bit different. So going into the mission, I knew I was going to be writing. I love to write by hand, and so I got myself a Fisher Space pen. So these are the types of pens that were used by the Apollo astronauts, just as sort of a symbolic gesture towards really going to the moon. But I knew I would be doing writing throughout, taking notes, just reflecting on that experience. But I also went into it knowing that I wanted to do some kind of printmaking. I think of mark making as something that's essentially human. So thinking about the Paleolithic cave paintings in France, in the Dordogne region, um, thinking about mark making, about language, about early writing, I wanted that to come with us to the moon. So when I started thinking about how could I bring printmaking into the lunar habitat, the trouble with printmaking is that it requires heavy and large presses for the most part. It requires ink and solvents to clean up the ink that are generally toxic, and it creates a fair bit of waste unless you're really, really careful about what you're doing. So all of those things were not going to work in this environment at SAM. It was an environment where we were trying to create no waste at all. We were recycling food scraps, any wrappers or containers from something that we brought in, we were collecting to take back with us after the mission. But so overall, we were just trying to create as little waste as possible, which just wasn't going to work with these more traditional printmaking techniques. So eventually, as I was thinking about how could I bring printmaking to the moon, I landed on the idea of 3D printing because there was a 3D printer available at SAM. And so what you're seeing here on the screen are images of me before the mission. This is the letterpress lab on campus at the University of Arizona, which has an incredible collection of presses and type. But so I took time to try to find a font that I could take and then turn into essentially something to 3D print. So here I am, I found a font called Mode Futura. It's likely from the 1950s and it's meant to be futuristic. So I thought that was an interesting way to think about taking this past, looking towards the future, picking it up again and kind of taking it into the simulated environment. So what I did is I printed what's called a specimen sheet, which is what you're seeing on the side of the screen. But so you're printing one of every letter. And then from that, I went to scanning that and creating 3D type. So although I did mention I was writing throughout, taking notes, preparing to write poems, before the mission started, I realized that it was very unlikely, given the fact that I was new to 3D printing and modeling, and just because we had a fairly compressed timeline, it was really unlikely that I was going to be able to create something that quickly, to create language that I would want to use in printing on the moon. So Chris had been thinking through, he mentioned earlier, just thinking about, he said, is the lunar ice a resource or a gift? And so he had started thinking through these aphorisms of what kind of language do we use to talk about the exploration that we're doing? What kind of language do we use to talk about life on the moon? And one of those aphorisms was frontier or heartland. And in the American context, the word frontier carries a lot of negative baggage related to expansion of white colonial settlers westward across the country, mainly in the 19th century, really destroying the land, oppressing indigenous populations and murdering them. And all of this sort of sense of we're doing this, the frontier is where we kind of fulfill our destiny. So at least in the US context, that has very negative connotations. And it's a word that's used in talking about space. Even in things I love, like Star Trek, it's the final frontier. But if we're going to think about it, if we're going to take this word that has all of this baggage in the US and take it with us to the moon, what are we taking with us? Are we taking that whole, no matter what, we're going to have to deal with taking that whole history. But can we maybe choose different words that will lead us to think differently about what we're doing? So the word that we kind of settled on as a contrast to frontier was heartland. So a place that's home, that we love, that we cherish, that we see as something that is a part of us. And so what I ended up doing with these, with this 3D printed, these 3D printed letters, the way I decided to create the print was instead of using any kind of ink, I created a stamp, which I have here. And during my EVA, during my simulated moonwalk, I took this with me and had made an impression in the simulated lunar regolith that was outside. So it was leaving a mark on the moon where there's no atmosphere, there's no weather, there's nothing that, at least in the relatively long term of human experience on the moon, would wipe away that mark. And so to go back to that idea of mark making, that it's essentially human, that it's a way that we record our experience of the world, that we interact with the world. This was a way that I was going to take language and leave language on the moon. Or we also thought about it as, what if I left this mark in near the ascent vehicle that would take us off the moon at the end of the mission? And then also it could be then deliberately wiped away by us leaving. So choosing on the moon to have this piece of artwork that's meant to provoke thought, but then also deliberately wiping it away, saying we're choosing not to leave these long-term marks on a place that has a life of its own. So this is an image. So here's the 3D model that I used or created. Over on the other side, then you're seeing the 3D printer in SAM printing that stamp. So here I am, you're seeing in the background that pouch that Chris mentioned that Ivy created for us for our EVAs. And then you're seeing that stamp. And it was interesting then when we really got down to it of being outside in the pressure suit, you have big gloves on, and it becomes a lot more difficult to handle this little knob, which I made as big as I could. But it's just this different physical experience. Nothing is easy. But so during my EVA then, while wearing the harness to make it as if I'm in the moon's 1/6 gravity, this is an image of that impression that I made in the simulated lunar regolith. So it's not super clear, but it actually did hold that impression very well. It's crushed up basalt, and it's fine enough that you could push in and then lift it out again. You're also seeing then a boot print next to it from me as I kind of had to stumble through that area. But this was the outcome of thinking about physical language, a human technology, an ancient technology of printing, going to the moon, and leaving this statement, asking us to think about the way that we use words. In addition to that, then, as I had mentioned at the beginning, I spent time writing. I spent a lot of time in the lung, just, doing kind of journaling, free thinking, just working my way through the experience and trying to record what it was like to be inside Sam. And so let me see. Yeah, that was my last slide. So what I'll do for you then is just read the poem. So I only ended up writing one complete poem while I was in Sam. It was a short time. It was a time where there was a lot to do and take care of, making sure all the systems were running, that we were eating, that we were sleeping, all of those things. But so I wrote one complete poem while we were there. And then afterwards, if you see in that photo, I just did a lot of writing. And so just recently I've come back to that and started writing again. But I'll go back and read to you from the piece that I wrote in the moon, on the moon, sitting with my crewmates working around me. And so in this poem, you'll hear references to Ivy sewing. You might hear some references to Chris thinking, Liz thinking, all of us thinking through what we were doing. You'll also hear a reference to the plant growth experiment that Chris mentioned, and then also the mushrooms. You saw mushrooms in that one image. One of the things we did is dried up the leftovers from all of our food, put them into a dehydrator so they would completely dry out, grind them up, and then the long-term plan is to be able to feed those to a mushroom colony. That then we ate some of those mushrooms. So it's this whole closed loop system. But so I'll read you this one poem, the title of which is To Be in Thought, a Lunar Being. And this is a quote from the 19th century selenographer James Naismith, who Chris brought him to our attention. So he's talking about mapping the moon through a telescope, and that through his imagination, he can become a lunar being in that act, much like we then were doing at SAM. So to be in thought, a lunar being. Anywhere we go, the body must be fed and held against something, rock, or the motion of endless falling, metal, or the sound another human makes while working needle through fabric, thought across time's finest length. Anywhere we go, the mind will fall inward through the distance that divides the eye from the flash thought threads between neurons, between sunlight through Earth's atmosphere and the hard shadows cast by the moon's rounded peaks. We travel in thought, past wind moving the shades, or we find we cannot, the pull of Earth's metal core too much to forget. Tend now to breath and the color it floods through every vein. Tend the smallest leaves reaching through lunar dust in a test tube, and mushrooms' ribbed throats curling toward Earth's imagined disk above. Home, mirroring home. What we leave, sending back what can never stay behind, sown through flesh and dream, through the sudden horizon. So I was happy to have been able to write a complete poem. It can be mysterious in writing poems when they really come together to completion, and when they're going to take a lot of time to percolate. So I'm now having written that one back in March, I'm now in that percolating phase and seeing the fruits of that. And so in the new writing that I'm doing, also coming out of this time, I'm thinking a lot about that work of tending, of homekeeping, of housekeeping, and just living in the space with other people and what that means. We do that everywhere. We do that on Earth. I think we'll do that anywhere that we might go in the future of humanity. And so that's one of the main modes of thinking that I'm bringing to this. But so I'll stop there and I will turn things over to my colleague, Liz George.
Thanks, Julie. My name is Liz George, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Dance at the University of Arizona. So yeah, let's just go to the next slide. Thank you, Julie. Okay, so this is a photo of me making some moves in the lung. And as Chris said, this is the place in the habitat that controls the pressure. And I spent a lot of time here. It felt like, to me, it was a really clear and clean space. There was a sense of like almost like hollowness and emptiness that I imagine feeling maybe being on the moon. And so I felt really blessed to have this space and this amount of space to create movement. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Julie. Okay, so tunnel, light, roll, and float. So this is the tunnel, you saw that earlier, this tunnel that I'm kind of moving out of leads into the lung space. So pretty much on the first night that I was there, started to explore with movement in this tunnel space. So qualities of movement, effort, shape, qualities that consisted of like rolling, floating, kind of the essence of how I would imagine feeling on the moon in a 1/6 gravity space. So these images were all captured. The light in the lung was really beautiful and inspiring to move through and to capture some images. Okay, thank you, Julie. Next slide. Okay, so confined space, obviously, all of us in our own ways, in the habitat as a whole, we're dealing with confined spaces just like you would on a spaceship. And so this I thought was a good opportunity, the tunnel space, to really explore how it feels to move in a confined space with imagery and my experience as a dancer in mind. And so I had a past colleague and friend who was just a real expert in the field of choreography and teaching choreography. And he would always say, Douglas Nielsen would always say, make a rule and break it. And so just a very basic kind of choreographic tool that I played around with in this space. Like, for instance, as a dancer, you would say, okay, so how can I move? How long can I move with my right hand connected to the surface? And then you just explore, and then you move as far as you can, and then you break that rule. And so it kind of got me thinking about how rules from a scientific perspective oftentimes are felt as absolutes, and as artists, how rules kind of serve to inspire. So how you can just use a rule as inspiration and break it to move you to the next thing. So there was that connection there, and that obviously is a photo. Oh, it's a video. Okay. Okay, thanks, Julie. Okay, this one. Oh, okay. And so I don't know, do we have time to show this whole thing, the Moon River?
I think so. It's about 2 minutes or less.
Okay. So I had a playlist in creating this movement in the lung, and Audrey Hepburn's version of Moon River came up. And so I kind of created this story of like the tunnel being the spaceship and moving out of the spaceship, landing on the surface of the moon, exploring the moon, and then running and jumping back into the spaceship. And so this is very much a work in progress, and it was something that I put together while in the habitat. And I'm also working with some people to kind of piece a little bit more of the footage that I got together in a little bit more of an abstract way. And so well, we can just go ahead and play this, knowing that storyline, giving you some context. This is Moon River.
Moon River, wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style someday. Oh, dream maker, you heartbreaker, wherever you're going, I'm going your way. Two drifters off to see the world. There's such a lot of world to see. We're after the same rainbows and waiting round the bend. My huckleberry friend, moon, river, and me.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Yeah, and I'm really hoping to, and part of where I feel like I'm at in my work at the university as a teacher and a researcher is to really find ways to connect the students to my work and collaborate in that way and not keep it, just share the work. And so working towards getting the students in that space next semester, have gotten some good support again from the College of Fine Arts and the people and everyone involved in this project to continue to move and use this momentum to connect with the students in my work as a choreographer, someone who creates movement, and also as a teacher in class. Okay, so I just included this because Chris touched upon, just humor and lightness, and I do feel like anytime you're in a new environment, especially in a confined space, and just like as a human being, not to take our work too seriously. And I feel like, for myself as an artist, when I can get in that zone of just feeling lighter about it, it removes the expectations and it just makes things more fun. There's the element of play that comes into my work, at least as an artist. So go ahead and maybe show the, okay, that's fine. Yeah, that one's the less funny one. I hit my head. This one's more funny. Oh, yeah. So I was fine, and
there was no first aid required.
right. I mean, sometimes when I show people that, it depends on how everyone's feeling. Like some people are really concerned. Anyway, that was just some of the bloopers. Okay, and then the EVA exploration. I put dancing in costume. So a lot of my work in preparation for this felt connected to the EVA, which is the extravehicular activity, moving from the pressurized habitat onto outside in the moon, in essence, and onto the 1/6 gravity rig. So here are just a couple pictures of me playing around before we went in to the mission without the suit. And then we were able to I was able to put on the suit and just kind of move around a bit just in preparation for getting onto the rig, and the crew was super supportive with all of that. Okay, next slide, Julie. Thank you. Oh, there's a video. So yeah, as a dancer, I'll just touch on that 1/6 gravity zone was super magical in the sense that there was that sense of floating, and I've talked about this before. We have a term that's used in ballet class called ballon, and it's light-footedness. And while jumping, it's a very desirable aesthetic in ballet class. And so it's just kind of that pocket of space that you are in, you hope to kind of land in when you're jumping. And obviously in the 1/6 gravity zone, that's way more accessible. So that was super fun to play around with. And then I think this is just some footage that Arlene took of the actual EVA. Okay, so yeah, this is me getting into the suit, and Trent, Trash, and Matthias, who work up at the Biosphere and then in human design and space exploration. Yeah, so this is me moving in the suit. So it's super fun to jump and feel like you have way more time to come down. Some things that just kind of were challenges, and I look forward to possibly exploring more, is just the ability, the fine motor ability. And Julie talked about that too. And like as a dancer, just how important it is and how we spend a lifetime just trying to articulate in a very detailed way, even with our fingers and our feet, just having our feet connect with the floor and really feel the surface of the floor and push against the floor in order to kind of align everything and move in a really full way. That isn't as accessible in one, the suit, and then two, in the 1/6 gravity elements. Okay, the next slide. Oh, and then Julie and Chris too, I think you kind of initiated the slide projection, which was amazing to have in the lung, just to kind of give us that connection to the visual of the moon. As Julie said, you know, being in the desert, just really trying to bring the spirit of the moon into the habitat with us. So kind of happened spontaneously, just some movement exploration with shadow, shape, and mirroring images. But here's some footage from that again in the lung stage. Okay, thank you, Julie. Next slide. Okay, just some more images and trying to create shape inspired by the images that were projected in the lung. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Julie. Okay, so yoga, I'm also a yoga teacher in town, and also use it just for my personal health and well-being. And so I'm in the biosphere suit that Linda Lay wore. She was one of the original biospherians. And so got to do yoga in the suit, which was a really fun experience. And I remember when the biospherians went into the habitat, and it was the early 80s, right? Chris would know probably. I remember that because I grew up in Tucson and watching that on TV. So that was really special, kind of full circle. Like all of a sudden I'm in her suit. It was cool. And then again, happy us, and a picture of my hair, because we had to conserve water. And so we weren't able to wash our hair. And so that's about how I looked. And so that was kind of fun. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a collaborate, experience, and share. So this is Trent Tresh, who works in the human design and space exploration at the U of A, and then connects his work with the biosphere and works up there. And he came to one of my advanced choreography classes that I teach, and the students got to explore movement in the spacesuit and connect with those restrictions and how those restrictions affected them. Oftentimes having those restrictions, I find, can kind of move us into a place of freedom as a dancer when we move. Like, for instance, like when we move towards our habits, sometimes connecting to our habits creates a really comfortable space where new things can emerge. So it felt very similar to the idea of that. So they had a lot of fun with that. Okay, next slide. Okay, yeah, so this was just another picture of that, and just continuing to connect the work that I am doing, and the work that came from and was inspired by this project, and move it back to the students. Okay, thank you, everyone. This is Ivy.
Hello. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
sure.
All right. So yes, I'm Ivy Wahome, and I am the textile artist. I got involved in this project by signing up for it. It was posted on one of our College of Fine Arts websites, and So when I looked at the project, I was like, this is something that could be interesting for me. So I'm glad that I was able to work on this project, because it took me from sewing in theater, and now I'm sewing in a different field completely. So yep, that's my intro. So what I decided to do with my, specialty as a seamstress was to capture sort of like photographs of everything we were doing while we were in the habitat. So this is one of the patches that I created, and it's sort of like a book about how to sew in space. Next slide. This was my favorite place to work in. I worked mostly in the test module. It had the most light, and I could, lay all of my art supplies on the floor and see it, without having to move anything around. So it was like, this is where I sort of took all the stuff that we were doing each day and sort of using fabric to interpret it and to, like, create an applique that I was going to apply to my final project. Next slide. So when we got there, we hadn't realized that we needed a bag to carry some of the stuff that we were going to take on our EVAs. So I had created that image prior, but I hadn't put it together. So it was great to not put it together beforehand, because when we got in the habitat, I was able to make sure that it would fit both Julie's stamp and could fit Christopher's camera. And it's an image of a rocket that's shooting to space, and it's done with it's a special type of sewing technique, which is free motion, where it's almost like you just run your machine anywhere you like to create images with the sewing, the stitches. Next slide. So that's me putting it together with embroidery stitches. Sometimes, my machine wouldn't work, and I had to figure out how to do something by hand. So it was good to have, the option of using the sewing machine. But when it didn't work, I had to improvise and figure out how to put the pieces together. So this is me trying to put the two pieces together before the EVAs. Next slide. While we were in the habitat, I had the idea of pretending like we had set foot on the moon. And so I took this sheer fabric and I outlined all of the crew members' feet, I guess. and then I embroidered each of our names. And this is the type of fabric that when you put it in water, it dissolves. So I just had the outline perfectly on the tapestry after I dissolved it. So that was one of the things that came up while we were in the habitat. I wanted to capture things without prior planning. It was almost like what inspired me, like last minute, what is like the thing that stands out without having to plan ahead. So it was almost like improvising and going with the flow sort of thing. And that's me also wearing the jumpsuit from our friend Linda Lane. All right, next slide. So this is me attempting to sew on my EVA with the gloves on. I don't know, it was really difficult because I've never actually attempted to sew with anything between me and the fabric. So that is something that I realized after the mission, that I would, if anyone would have to sew while they are, walking on the surface of the moon, is how do we get enough the fabric to be thin enough so that you can still feel what you're doing. That was the most difficult part. Like when Liz talks about her connection with the ground when she's dancing, it's the same thing with my connection with the fabric. And so that was, I only managed a couple stitches before it just didn't feel like I was getting it right. So that was a great experience. Next slide. Yeah, so this is me here again, taking every inspiration that I could get from all my team members. I was looking at magazines. I was looking at all the photographs that Chris was taking with his Polaroid camera. I was also taking care of the plants. So this on towards my left is the hydroponics, and I was checking them every day and making sure I put the measurements down. And also just making sure everything, the pressure was looking good because there was a gauge that I had to look at. I think as somebody who works backstage, working with a team and like housekeeping, making sure you have a checklist of things and timing yourself was pretty normal to me. I've done that all my life backstage. So it was really nice to do what I normally do in a different setting. So yeah, next slide. So this is when I got this project, I thought to myself, what would I take if I was to go to the moon for real? And I wanted to take something that was personal to me. So this is a blanket that I grew up, using when I was in Kenya as a child. And I would sleep looking at the moon, but I never really thought about what it was. I would just fall asleep seeing it there. And so when I got this project, I was like, well, I don't know much about the moon, but I can, remind myself what I used to feel when I was a child looking at it. And then now having this project that I'm now doing. So, I mean, I came up with a shelf, and those would be the shelf, like a bookshelf, where all the research that we had done, all the books that we had read, and different appliques of things that had happened, I would apply those in the shelf, and then I would create the moon which is what I used to create our logo. And those are the 4 footprints of the team members. Next slide. So this is me sort of placing each thing where I felt like it made the piece sort of balanced. And also I was strategically placing them too, because this is an old blanket. So some of the areas of the blanket were falling apart, they were bruised, they were burnt. So I was also thinking about recycling, repurposing, being, not trying to think about the future, how we're gonna be, less, using too much stuff. How do you use what you already have? So that's why I wanted to use something I had, and I wanted to apply the new ideas over and create a new piece. So you can see the bag that we used is in there. Liz's silhouette as she's dancing, holding the moon on her head, and Julie's stamp, and just different things that I wanted to put around to create an idea of what we were doing inside the habitat. Next slide, please. So that's the technique that I'm talking about, this the free motion, and it's pretty easy to do. You can do it with any machine, and it's almost like it's a good idea to have that if you were going to, like, say, be locked up for a week. You can create your own patches and almost document whatever it is that you're doing through sewing, but not writing it with a pen. Next slide. So yeah, this is what came up after the mission. Trent wanted to start a spacesuit lab on campus, and Ellen McMahon helped and supported that project, and we ended up having a really nice studio space to work out of and explore and have Liz's students come over and you know, dance around and feel what it's like to dance with a pressurized suit. Next slide. So that was the logo that Chris was referring to. And so I basically made it with fabric. I had felt, I had canvas, I had cotton, beads. So I used fabrics that I already have to create this picture. And then I sewed it on, and then we turned it into a digital picture and used it as our logo. So in real life, it's sort of like a 3-dimensional because it has layers. And so everything is kind of layered on top of each other. But on the photo, it's just flat. I wanted to show the difference. That's my graduation hat that I had my the image sewn on. Next slide. And so this is the last time I worked on the blanket. I added Julie's poem on the back of the blanket, the entire poem. And I'm eventually going to go over those words with embroidery stitches so that it's almost like they're permanent. They're not, you know, but they won't show on the other side. It's just going to be on the back. And then I also put the logo that the print that Julie created on the back, just to show that we are thinking about, is it a place that we are going to use as a gift or something we're going to use as a resource. And then I added a bunch of other items down on the shelf, and then I had a beads added to the bottom of it. And the moon is actually also padded, so it looks like a pillow. So it kind of pops out. Next slide. And that's it when it's lying down flat. You can see one of Julie's and Chris's books is added to it. And yeah, it's a lot of embroidery, handwork, hand stitches, almost like I was putting my heart and thinking that if this could be taken back to Earth, it could also be like a document that has been, you know, documented on a piece of fabric. All right, yeah. Next slide. Yeah, that's it from a different angle with the stars and the moon and the sun. Next slide. Yeah, and that's it.
Thank you all. It was a very exciting experience, I believe, and your presentations were wonderful. Thank you. Lisa, do you want to comment now? Ask questions?
Well, thank you for that presentation. It was so interesting to see how individual each person's experience was, even though you were all living in the same quite limited space. It just reminds me that that's what we want art to do, is to see it through that individual's eyes. And yeah, so it's extraordinary. What I was wondering about is kind of related to confronting expectations. So, for instance, I think all of you might have had imagined how it would be, this experience, both physically and creatively. And what surprised you about the reality of what actually happened? I think maybe each of you could comment for just a few minutes about how, you know, how those two things butted up against each other. Maybe Chris wants to start.
Sure, Lisa, no, that's a great question. I think one way I would answer it would be, well, there are two things I would say. One is, and this sort of leads into the second point, it took so much planning time, logistics, and working with Kai and his crew at SAM because this was going to be a pretty complicated mission for them. And so, honestly, when we sealed the airlock door, I felt a sense of relief. It's like, oh my God, we're in, we're done. It's like not done, but like the planning's over. It's like now we have a week to spend. And so there was a sense, it just felt calm, actually. We had, there were some initial issues with some pressurizing the habitat to the correct factor and so forth. And we had, a few other small challenges like that, but the week went very smoothly. And so I don't know that I had expectations that we would have a lot of difficulties, but I was sort of, just relieved and happy that things went as smoothly as they did. And in large part too, is because we all got along so well. And it's a very small space. And I put in the chat, I think Glafke shared that with the participants. It's a small space. It is well designed in that, you can be in one part of it and not see other people, but you could still hear people. We were very mindful of each other's needs and, very considerate and kind about, asking if someone needed to be alone and what have you. So I don't know if that's directly answering your question, but that was just one of the things that I came away just feeling really gratified by.
Great.
Yeah, so one of the things that I mentioned a little bit, and then Chris mentioned a little bit, was really that sense of housekeeping or homekeeping, tending. I didn't expect so much to think about that because you imagine you're in this very technological space, but you're also cooking. It's like, you're cooking each meal, and so it's like we traded off who cooked, or we tried to keep breakfast or lunch really simple. But there was always a little bit of tending to do. And so that really brought me into more of thinking about domestic spaces, which I think is interesting to say we're going to go to the moon. We're going to think about exploring this very different place, but at the same time, we take home with us. We take those basic aspects of being human with us. So being domestic on the moon was the surprise for me.
Uh-huh.
I think when you asked that question, just one thing that came to mind was like product versus process in terms of just expectation. And I feel like as someone who moves on a regular basis and creates movement, it's experiential. And so I felt like I was kind of moving into the space because we did have a lot of just real collaborative energy built up that I don't feel like there was any kind of like expectation. I mean, I felt some anxiety, some nervous energy around I feel like mine was the EVA, the actual mechanics of leaving the habitat and coming back. Like I felt a ton of pressure with that. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to mess up this whole, like the pressurized habitat in like just the logistics of that. And so I do feel like maybe that was just something that came to mind once I was in there that I didn't necessarily expect. I wasn't sure how I would connect with that. And yeah, so just like enjoying the process and helps me like when I move in that direction. And we've talked a lot about mindfulness too, and like moving in a very careful way and connected, being present. And I felt like we were all very much in that zone and sensitive to where we all were in space, which was also really helpful and connected to just the idea of process for me.
It was interesting your comments about being in the 1/6 gravity simulator and thinking about feet and how different your feet would feel if you were walking on the moon. And I remember learning once that the tissue on the feet give you a lot of sensory feedback. As they hit the pressure of the ground, they spread a little, and that actually feeds back to your whole sensory system about the feeling of balance and up and down, etc. Was that very confusing, that experience of trying to make movements like that, like you were dancing?
Yeah, I love that, Lisa, that comment. And I don't know if it was so much confusing, it just felt new. And it felt like a space that I would love to explore more. And it got me thinking about how then I could use that experience in my teaching. And so I'm kind of in this phase now in my teaching. Like I feel like I go through these waves of how I teach through the years, and now we start the bar, and I have this whole meditative thing in first position. We stand at the bar, and plies are generally the first exercise. It's pretty codified that way in a ballet class. And I have them close their eyes and connect to the surface of the floor and just feel the soles of the feet connected to the floor, and how different it feels to push down into the floor opposed to away from the floor. Like all these intricacies of just the connection to the floor. And not that I didn't explore that before, it just gave me new perspective.
Sure, great.
Ivy?
About surprises, I think on the same note with being connected to whatever you're doing, I never thought about sewing before with these gloves on. And when I got in there, I was like, oh my God, this is impossible. There's no way. So that will be a challenge going forward. Like, how do we, because as a textile person, everything has to be like, touch and feel. So we'll see. It was a challenge. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
It does bring up the point that if any of us went to the moon, we will never actually touch it while we're there. And how the suits and actually interacting with the natural surroundings will always be limited, because you will never feel it on your skin. You will never smell it, although I've heard that you can. I think Gene Cernan said that he smelled it inside the capsule when he was repressurizing. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think. How do you connect with the natural environment when you don't have that tactile feedback in the same way? Anyway, Remo, did you have any questions?
No, I would like to ask Christina to ask a question or add comments.
Oh, yes.
Hi. Great. Thank you. First of all, congrats for your presentation. It was really, really interesting to see an analog mission full of artists, but it's quite unusual. So, yeah, congrats. I have 52 questions, so I will ask only 2 of them. So, for all of you, first of all, how does your experience on the analog challenge your imaginaries of space right now? And also, did you ever feel connected to space during your analog mission, or do you feel more connected now to the space and outer space after your analog?
Yeah, I can start. So,
yes, please.
yes, yeah. So thinking about Chris and I were coming from a background where we both have a long-term interest in space, and spent, I think, almost 5 years, 4 years working together on a book, thinking about poets, thinking about space. And so I think between the two of us, we had probably done a lot of imaginative, entering into that space. Probably Chris the most of all, having done a prior analog mission, although that was for Mars. But one of the challenges of being in the analog environment was that test module where you saw in Ivy's photos, it's glass, it's beautiful. They tried to cover up the windows with some paneling that would not entirely block the light, but at least kind of block our view out. But it only does so much. So there was a fair bit of having to kind of convince ourselves that we were there. And then the reality of that you're not there. You're just doing your best to imagine that for the purpose of contributing to our understanding of what it would be like to be there. So that's one thing that since I mentioned I'm coming back to writing, it's challenging when I'm sitting at my desk, which is just, over here to my right. And I have this beautiful big window that looks out on a tree and again, a very clearly desert reality. Just to then again kind of try to turn inward and say, how can I imagine again, how can I take all the research or the reading I've done about the moon and try to place myself there while still acknowledging that it's an imaginative act rather than a real one at this point.
Mm.
I felt the most connected to the moon in the lung, in that habitat. So when I was in the tunnel, I felt very much how I would imagine it would feel being in a confined space without any windows and light. And in the lung space. So I felt like when I was in that space that I was on the moon. Oftentimes, I very much felt like I could imagine that. And then after the experience, you asked how we feel after the experience, more connected. And Chris and Julie have just like a wealth of information about the moon and things that I never would have. I just never knew. And so I feel I've always felt connected to the moon and the stars, and kind of in an astrological sense, like I like that. And just like the amount of history and the just wealth of information that they kind of infused into our process of training while we were there. Definitely feel more connected after the mission.
I don't know. I don't know, want to interrupt anyone. I feel like I connected more to it afterwards because I didn't know so much about the moon. I never thought about the moon as much. So like nowadays when I look at the moon, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember we talked about Shackleton Base and like how the moon has very smooth surfaces and not sharp edges. So it was afterwards that I appreciated the moon.
I would just add, I feel like I'm really glad that you're that's in Ivy's head now. In the 19th century, people thought the mountains of the moon were like the Himalayas, even though there was plenty of evidence that it wasn't. So for me, it was a twofold thing. One, I've spent a lot of time and still spend a lot of time looking at the moon through the telescope. And so I feel really grounded, in this dual sense, looking at the moon from the Earth. And so I have, like the grays, the different landscapes of the moon, all that's like in my head. But during the mission, for me, it was being in the pressure suit. And so the external area wasn't completed. They now have sort of sculpted it so it looks like a rocky landscape. So you could see, there was just like plywood and concrete. But being in the pressure suit was profoundly interesting to me. It was hard. And it gave me a deeply renewed appreciation, a physical appreciation for how hard it is for astronauts to actually do their work.
We have still 3 minutes. Christina, do you have another question?
Yeah, it's nice that you have pointed out all about the EVA suite and your interface with the world. Could you go deeper into that experience, because it's really, really interesting?
Can you repeat that, Christina? There was some background noise. I couldn't quite catch what you were saying.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying if you could go deeper into your experience with the EVA suit and the interface with the world and with the outer worlds, of course.
Yeah, I feel like that being in the suit was well, others can speak to this too. Like one, I can get a little claustrophobic. So I was a little, if I'm answering your question, if I heard it correctly, it felt like just you're all puffed up. It is stiff, like Ivy was saying. The gloves are very stiff. The helmet was large enough actually that I didn't feel super confined, but you had this air blowing across your face. And so it was loud, actually. I found it loud. We had no radio, So we communicated with hand signals with the crew, the safety crew that that were tending us. I found it hard to walk, and it took a little while to sort of get that gait, that correct gait. And manipulating the camera was difficult. And I don't know how long we were each out, but I was out long enough that I was, I had a sweatband on. I was sweating a lot. And now sort of like in retrospect, thinking about that experience, I'd kind of like to do it again. But I don't know. Other folks have thoughts about the EVAs and the pressure suits?
Yeah, just that it's so different. Yeah, it's different, and I wish I could have done it again to have more experience. But Ivy,
Well, there was one memory that I have where I got stuck. We couldn't get me out, and I started freaking out. Like Chris was saying, if you're claustrophobic and you want to get out of it. So there was a time that mine wasn't, they couldn't unlock it. And I was,
We're
oh
like
my
we're
God,
in the airlock.
yeah,
Yeah, we're getting you out of the suit. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So that was scary to think that, oh my God, if I can't get out of this thing, is the mission going to be canceled? Or
we got her out. It was all okay.
Yeah, I feel like oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, what occurs to me is that again, because you, Liz, and Ivy, you've spent so much time working backstage in productions, it's like an unusual bonus of like you knew how to get people in and out of costumes relatively quickly, and that helped us. Yeah, go ahead, Liz. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that if I had to do it again, I feel like I would have more control over just my monitoring my breath. Like I felt out of breath, trying to move in a really athletic way. And once I got myself going, because in the 1/6 gravity zone, it's hard to stop. And so I felt like I kind of got into performance mode as, a dancer. I was like, okay, I just have to, make the show happen. And so I feel like, if I had to do it again, I would experiment with like how I can stop and just take breaks and continue on. So that was one challenge. And with the breath, I felt there was some anxiety that kind of set in, that just as if I had the opportunity to experiment more, that I could learn to work with.
Would you do the same experience also on an upper level, let's say on the space station?
I think so.
I would like to
Yeah.
think that I would. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll stay on Earth and they can send messages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us want to go to Mars. But yeah, I don't know. That's a much longer experience. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
Ivy's also got some spacesuit, some pressure suit models behind her, which I think if we sent Liz to the ISS, she could be well equipped with a more flexible suit.
I love it.
Okay, I think we have at the end of our time. Thank you all. It was a great webinar, and I hope I'll see you another time on another project. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Remo. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coordinating, and thank you everyone for being here.